Welcome back to ABA Beyond the Data. I'm your host, Jay Burton, BCBA, and more importantly, the dad of two awesome boys who just happen to be on the autism spectrum. This show is designed for behavior analysts and others working in the field of ABA who are trying to bridge the gap between the research we read and what actually happens in real life with the real kids and real families we work with. Because ABA is not just a bunch of graphs and data sheets and treatment plans. It's about people, it's about families, and it's about the child sitting across from us at the work table and sometimes at the dinner table. And that's exactly what we will be discussing today in part 2 of Beyond the Bite. And today we are going to slow way down and really look at Dr. Holly Gover's work on choice, assent, and trauma-informed feeding interventions. But before we get into the research, I want to start with a story from pretty early in my career. This was around 2013 or maybe 2014, and I was still working as a behavior technician. I don't even think the field had RBTs at this point, and my company was definitely not doing it. If they did. I was working on a team with a kid who was about 9 years old, and part of his program was feeding. And specifically, the BCBA had decided to target, for whatever reason, broccoli. And I know, broccoli sounds almost silly when you say it out loud. Like all the things in the world, why are we emotionally damaging a child over tiny green trees? Like 90% of kids nowadays don't want to eat broccoli. I don't think I did as a kid. So why the heck are we forcing this child to? But for this child, broccoli was not just a non-preferred food. Broccoli was a full body no. But at this time, I was the behavior technician. I was new to his team. I was not the one writing the plan, obviously. I was not the BCBA. I was just a BT trying to follow protocol and do what I was being told was quote unquote evidence-based treatment. And yeah, it technically was. And the plan started with him just tolerating being in the same room as broccoli, not eating it, not touching it, just being near it. So the BCBA brought him into the room, and as soon as he saw the broccoli, he fell apart. And not in some fake or behaviorally shaped mechanism to escape the situation. This was a visceral, emotional response to being in this environment and knowing what was about to happen. In retrospect, in looking back at this now, I now know this was a trauma response. This was a child genuinely in distress. His face changed, his body changed. He started crying, and he ran to me. He ran to me and wrapped his arms around me. The only individual that had not participated in this intervention with him in the room. And he looks up at me and he says, Mr. J, please, please don't make me do this. I don't want to be in here. And that sentence has haunted me. I don't know what led to this emotional response, but clearly there was some emotional baggage. Not just behavioral escape maintain responses, guys. That's not what we're looking at right now. That's not what we're talking about. This child had had experiences with broccoli that had brought him to the point where this was no longer about escape. It was a true emotional response. And he was not being subtle. He was not giving us some tiny little assent withdrawal signal. There was no room for interpretation of what he was saying. I do not want to do this. And I remember looking up at the BCBA, waiting for the plan to change, waiting for someone to say, okay, we pushed too far. Let's back up. But that is not what happened. The direction was basically to ignore it. Don't comfort him. Don't let him escape. Wait it out. After a minute, give him access to the reinforcer, which happened to be Nintendo. And I remember standing there with this child, holding on to me, crying, begging not to be there. And I had this feeling in my stomach that something that we were doing was wrong. But I did not have the language or the experience to understand that yet. I did not know how to talk about assent withdrawal. I did not know how to talk about trauma informed care at the time. I did not know how to say, this child is communicating clearly, and we are teaching him that his communication does not matter. I just knew that something about this was wrong. And I think a lot of us BCBAs, especially BCBAs that came into the field prior to Dr. Hanley coming out with his papers in the mid 2010s on assent based practices, a lot of us have this experience, these moments in our careers, moments where we look back and think, I was doing what I was trained to do. I was following the plan. I was trusting people above me. But man, do I wish I knew then what I do now. Because broccoli, for a child who is medically stable and eating enough calories and enough in other food groups, should not become a battlefield, should not become this trauma inducing event. And 13 years later, that moment has stayed with me because even back then, before I had the language for it, I knew I did not want to practice like that. I did not want feeding interventions to feel like a battle where the adult's job was to hold the line and the child's job was to eventually give in and give up. And I took this mindset with me, and years later in my career, I ended up working in a multidisciplinary setting. We had speech, OT, PT, and ABA all under one roof, and feeding was something that other disciplines were much more comfortable talking about than we were. A lot of feeding work I saw came from speech and OT, and some of it was influenced by the SOS feeding approach. And I'll be honest, at first, my ABA brain had questions because that is what we do, right? We sit there quietly, like, okay, but where's the data? What exactly are we measuring? What is the reinforcement contingency? How are we defining progress and success? These sorts of questions really make us fun at parties, don't they? But as I sat there and as I watched, I began to realize something. A lot of what they were doing was actually very behavioral. They were shaping, they were fading, they were arranging the environment, they were pairing food with positive experiences, they were building tolerance in small steps, and they were paying attention to body language, approach, avoidance, and emotional responding. And I remember being a little frustrated by that. Not frustrated with them, frustrated by us as a field because I kept thinking, why is ABA not doing this better? So much of this fits into our science. So much of this is behavior analysis. But somehow, in feeding, our field has become so associated with escape extinction, pressure, non removal, and follow through. It was all these other fields that were the ones talking about this subject more naturally, about comfort, about pacing, about tolerance, and the child's relationship with food. And that bothered the heck out of me because ABA should be able to bring something powerful to feeding. We should be able to bring assessment. We should be able to bring shaping. We should be able to bring reinforcement. We should be able to bring data and treatment analysis and caregiver coaching. But we should also be able to do that without turning meals into power struggles, without turning everything into escape extinction. So for a while there, I lived in this kind of dual reality where I saw what OT and speech was doing, and I saw that their approach felt more humane. It felt more gradual and more respectful of the child's signals, but at the same time was lacking behavioral clarity. On the other side, though, I saw ABA feeding literature that had strong data and clear procedures, but often felt more intrusive than what I was comfortable with, especially for children who were medically stable and mostly dealing with selectivity issues. And I found myself, as I think a lot of BCBAs were doing, going at this alone, not doing exactly researched back methodologies. We were pulling from what we knew of desensitization, of toleration, of reinforcement systems, and at the time, what was coming out on assent based practices. But there was not an article that I could just pull and say, this is what I'm doing. And it was definitely not perfect. I will be very clear about that. This was not a perfect procedure that was written out. I am trying my best to work with these individuals, to work with other practices and come together to make plans that can help support this child without traumatizing him or putting him through escape extinction methodology, which was just not the right choice for many of these children. And then I came across the work of Dr. Holly Gover and her colleagues. And that was the first time I remember thinking, okay, this is the bridge we've been looking for. Because this was not anti ABA. This was very much ABA based. It was not just lead the child to the food and hope for the best, which in other practices, and no offense against them because their practices are often way more humane, but that's what it felt like sometimes. It was assessment, it was still reinforcement, it was shaping, it was toleration building, it was function based, and it was measurable. But it also gave the child a way to participate and a way to opt out, a way to come back, a way to make choices around what they were doing in therapy, which is like mind boggling, right? Giving the child a choice of what they're going to work on what things they're going to be practicing. Mind boggling when I came across this article, right? Seeing feeding based research that actually put assent and withdrawal mechanisms into the treatment design. It was amazing to see. And most importantly, aligned where our field has been going for over the last decade, especially through Dr. Hanley's work with practical functional assessments, skill based treatment, synthesized reinforcement, and enhanced choice, where these things were finally being applied directly to feeding. And of all things in our field that needed a shift, feeding needed that. And if you don't fully understand why, go listen to the last episode. So today's episode is really about that bridge. It's about how we take the science of ABA and apply it to feeding in a way that is structured, effective, and most importantly, ethical. It is about how we move from pressure to participation. And that is why we'll be diving deep into Dr. Gover's paper. Because for me, this work gives us a clear picture of what ABA feeding interventions can look like when it's built around choice, assent, shaping, and trauma informed practices. Now, if you listened to part one, we spent a lot of time laying the foundation. We talked about how feeding concerns are not all the same. A child who eats a limited range of food is not automatically in the same clinical category as a child with choking concerns, swallowing concerns. They're experiencing weight loss, dehydration, they're tube dependent, or have oral motor deficits. We also talked about how older ABA feeding literature was heavily leaning on escape extinction. We talked about why that history matters to where we are today, but also why that cannot be our automatic starting point for every child with food selectivity. Part one is really the roadmap of how we end up at being at Dr. Holly Gover's work and how you make the decision that this is the right intervention to use with this child and whether or not you need to refer this child out to another practice or at least get another practice's participation in the intervention. But part two is different. Today, we are going to slow down and look at what this actually looks like in practice. We're going to talk about caregiver collaboration, food selection, preference assessments, practical functional assessment logic, opt in and opt out strategies, which I love. And of course, we're going to be hitting on some shaping, and differential reinforcement, which, come on, every good intervention needs, right? But I do want to be very clear from the start, this episode is not meant to make you a feeding expert. Please do not listen to this and walk in the clinic tomorrow and be like, all right, every child I am doing this intervention with. While this intervention can be done by yourself as a BCBA, if you are newer to feeding, you still need to reach out to those other disciplines and make sure that we have covered swallowing, chewing concerns, pain, oral motor concerns, and that we have medical clearance. We don't move into that unless you feel solid about those things, right? So if you are newer to feeding and you have not had the experience to identify and to be able to refer out when you see these things, then please seek out mentorship of a BCBA that has, or better yet, reach out into another field and get that direct support from outside the field. Either way, if there is true medical concerns, you're going to have to reach out. But reaching out to a BCBA who's had experience with feeding, especially this kind of feeding, will help guide you into making the best decision of where to refer them to if there is more medically complicated concerns. Again, go listen to part 1. Honestly, that is foundational because it will help guide you in making these decisions and honestly some strategies for where you can go to refer out. That is a very helpful episode. Neither of these episodes make you an expert. Honestly, no podcast on ABA can make you an expert of really any subject matter. But for medically stable cases where it's just food selectivity as a concern, I do think this work gives BCBAs a powerful way to think about feeding interventions because ABA belongs in feeding conversations, but only if we're willing to show up differently than we used to. And before we jump in, quick CEU reminder. ABA Beyond the Data is an AISCA-approved continuing education provider. If you are listening for CEUs, you can go to aba-ceus.com, find this episode under the Get CEUs tab, add it to your cart, and answer the 5 questions after listening. Those questions are not there to trick you or make you memorize article years. They are there just to show that you listened and understood the major points. All right, now with that said, let's go beyond the bite. So let's start with why this work was needed in the first place. And to understand that, I think we have to hold 2 things at the same time. The first thing is that ABA has a long history in feeding intervention. This is not some new area where behavior analysts just randomly decided one day, hey, food seems interesting. Let's jump in there. Behavior analytic feeding research goes back decades. So at no point in this episode should you come away thinking that ABA doesn't belong in the feeding realm. And it absolutely does not mean that we should not have a seat at the table for even more medically complicated cases. My point is that our history in feeding is complicated, to say the least. Because if you spend any time in older ABA feeding literature, you will notice pretty quickly that a lot of it leaned heavily on escape extinction and more restrictive procedures. We talked about this a lot in part 1, so I'm not going to rehash the whole thing here. But the basic idea was that refusal no longer produced escape from bites, and that aversive interventions such as physical guidance or representation of expelled bites was completely fine to be on the table. And let's be fair here. These procedures were effective. But what I struggle with, and what I think a lot of those in our field have started to struggle with, is whether or not those procedures can live in our current state of intervention. The field has evolved and progressed, but so has society around us. And would I rule out escape extinction for the most severe cases? I can't say that I completely would. But there is a big difference between a child who is medically unstable and not consuming enough to safely grow, And a child who is eating enough calories, eating some foods for many categories, medically cleared, but has a very narrow diet and a lot of distress around new foods. Those are not the same clinical pictures, right? And that is where Dr. Gover's work matters so much. Because this work asks a better question. It is not asking, can we force the child to eat? It is not even asking, can we increase the number of bites we're getting? It is asking, can we increase food engagement and consumption while protecting autonomy, participation, and dignity? That is the shift for this article because the goal was not just more bites. And I know that sounds simple, but in feeding work, that is a big deal because when bites become the only thing we care about, we can lose sight of everything else. We can lose sight of the child's experience. We can lose sight of whether the learner is participating or if they're just giving in and surrendering. We can lose sight of whether we are just building fear or if we are truly building flexibility. So let's slow down for a second and clearly define who is this work for? The type of model we are talking about here is for medically stable food selectivity. We are talking about children or learners who have a limited range of food, who may refuse certain textures, types, or even brands of food, but who are medically cleared and able to safely consume the kinds of foods and textures being targeted. This is not a model you jump into when a child is choking during a meal. It's not a model you jump into when a parent reports that they're coughing while eating, that they have wet vocal quality after swallowing, that they have unsafe chewing. Those are not let's just shape it situations. Those are we need the right people involved situations. And I know I'm sounding like a broken record here, but I really need to make this clear, guys. And I really encourage you all to go back to part one and listen how to identify these medical concerns. Because identifying these medical concerns will help you decide whether or not this intervention is the right intervention for the child you're working with because the most compassionate intervention in the world can still be dangerous if we apply it to the wrong clinical concern. Once we know we are dealing with medically stable food selectivity, the work does not start with the bite, it starts with the family. And as a parent of two boys on the spectrum, I love this part of the model because it is so easy in ABA to jump straight into target selection like we're building a clean little treatment plan in a vacuum. We can select great sounding programs like the kid will eat 5 novel foods and the child will be able to tolerate mixed textures and the client will eat one vegetable. And sure, that might be nice in a treatment plan, but whose life is that actually improving? Why that food? Why that goal? Why now? And in Gover's work, caregivers were involved from the beginning. They helped identify foods. They helped describe what mealtimes actually looked like. They helped clarify what the problem behaviors look like and what happened after it. And that is huge because feeding does not live in the clinic, guys. Feeding lives in the kitchen. It lives in lunchboxes sent to schools. It lives in restaurants. It lives at birthday parties. And if you're a parent, you know exactly what I mean because food is not just a clinical target, food is family life. It's culture, it's convenience, it's stress. It is whether you can go to a restaurant. It's whether your child can eat at school. I've traveled with enough snacks to survive a mild apocalypse because when you have a kid with feeding concerns, you do not just figure it out when you get there. So, caregiver collaboration is not just a nice little parent friendly add on. It is clinically necessary because caregivers know the real life impact of feeding concerns. They're the ones that understand what routines are falling apart. They're the ones that have already tried so many different things. They know the exact item that will rapidly turn into a battle and which items will quickly be adapted in the kitchen. They know which ones have been loved in the past but suddenly dropped for reasons unknown. But most importantly, parents and caregivers understand what this child needs to adapt best to their environment. Because let's get real, as clinicians, we want to pick items that seem, well, like clinical. We want to pick things with lots of protein or lots of fiber. We want the vegetables, the meats, the unprocessed things out there, right? All organic, gluten free, GMO free, or whatever, right? But is that what this child needs to thrive in his environment? It may not be. And don't get me wrong, nutrition is important. And I'm not saying that we look the other way on nutrition. No, absolutely not. But we have to make sure that we understand truly what the child is going through and what their environment looks like. Because sometimes the most meaningful feeding goal has nothing to do with kale or broccoli. And honestly, it is almost never and should never be kale. I don't know how kale has survived as a food. I really don't. Why is this still ending up on our plates? It's rabbit food, guys. Anyways, I digress. But sometimes the most meaningful thing can be something that can be easy to make, that can be easy to pop in the oven, get to the table fast because parents aren't just parents in this modern world. Parents are also full-time workers. They oftentimes have multiple children. Sometimes they have multiple kids on the spectrum. And I talk about this a lot in episode 1, so please go refer back to that. But I remember working with this one family in particular where the child was eating only one specific rice dish that could only be made by his grandmother. They had a freezer full of it, and it was healthy. It had rice, vegetables, protein, and it really smelled good. But this family was begging just to have something easy, something that they didn't need to rely on the grandmother for, so that they could go travel, so that they could go to restaurants without having to bring this dish. So if I had walked in as a clinician and only looked at nutrition, I might have thought, okay, this is not terrible. Let's work on some vegetables and maybe tolerating something that mom makes. But that was not the family's priority. Their goal was, can we go to a restaurant and order something normal off the menu, like chicken nuggets? And that's exactly what they wanted. Not because chicken nuggets were some perfect nutritional target, but because chicken nuggets were available almost everywhere. That one food could give the family access to restaurants, travel, community outings, and a little bit of normalcy. That is quality of life. And that is why it is so important that we collaborate with caregivers in the feeding process and that we interview them to understand where they're at. So when I'm meeting with these families, I want to think about things like, what is the child currently eating? I want to know what they used to eat. I want to know what foods they dropped because food dropping can tell us a lot. I also want to know what foods create the most stress in the household. And I want to know what sort of activities or moments does the family wish that they could have more of, but is being restricted because of feeding? Do they want to go to more birthday parties without bringing a giant cooler of their own child's food? Do they want the child just to eat in the cafeteria? Or do they just want to do some traveling? And most importantly, I want to know what has already been tried. What have they been trying to do? Or what other therapies have they tried to use to get this child to eat? If every previous attempt to introduce food turned into crying, gagging, pressure, or battle at the table, then that food does not enter the room neutral. That food has a history. The table itself has a history. The adults themselves presenting the food have a history. And if we ignore that history, we may think we are starting at step one, when for that child, we're actually starting at step 50 from a very long battle, or I guess a war around these food items. This is why caregiver input matters. It helps us choose foods that are meaningful, but it also helps us understand the emotional and behavioral context around those foods. It tells us what happens at home, it tells us what refusal looks like. And I want to know how the parents have been responding. Do they remove the food? Do they offer a safe food? Do they comfort? Do they keep pushing? Does the child leave the table? Does the meal end? Does everyone just try to survive until bedtime? And I say that with no judgment at all. And this needs to be very clear. No judgment at all. Guys, I have a whole podcast episode on parent training, and a lot of it is just about not judging parents. Listen to it if you need to. But with feeding, that is extra important. Feeding is an emotional topic. This is not the time to in any way judge what they have done to get food into their child. Unless you have been in their shoes, even if you are a parent of another child on the spectrum, and I am, you do not understand exactly what they have gone through. And that is always important to keep in mind. This entire interview process, as we start feeding, has to be a truly judgment free moment. Our job as BCBAs is not to walk in and judge the family's routine. Our job is to understand it. Because once we understand what matters to the family, we can build goals that actually belong in their life. And that is the difference between feeding goals that look good on paper and feeding goals that change something meaningful. And once we know what matters to the family, we still do not assume we know what the child prefers or refuses. That's when we assess. And I know that sounds obvious, but I think this one is one of those places where we can accidentally skip ahead because we feel like we know the answers because the parents have said he hates broccoli and the teacher has said he refuses yogurt and the RBT says he will never touch this specific food. And all of that information is important and it matters. And I'm not saying we ignore it. Caregivers' reports is extremely important, especially in feeding. But what this report really does is narrow down what we need to work on and specifies our starting point. And those details that let us understand what the starting point are critical. And that is one of the reasons I appreciate Gover's work. The assessment does not jump straight into here's the target, take a bite. That is not their baseline that they're using. And I love that. There is a process of understanding the foods, understanding the learner's preferences, and understanding where the child currently is before deciding where to begin. And that brings us to baseline. Baseline is where we find the starting line. And in feeding, that starting line matters a lot because if we start too high, we can create the very distress we are trying to avoid. If a child cannot tolerate food being near them and we start with take a bite, then that child is failing the program. The program failed to meet the child where they were. That's the part I want BCBAs to really sit with. Baseline engagement helps us answer a practical question. What can this learner currently do with this food calmly and voluntarily? And when we look at Gover's research, they really break this down. Can the child tolerate it even being in the room with them? Can they have it at the table? Can they look at it? How about can they touch it? And if they touch it, can it be with one finger or with the whole hand? And can they pick it up? Can they tolerate smelling it? Can they maybe bring it to their mouth? Maybe can they give it a kiss or a lick? And maybe can they try just the tiniest of bites? This is the type of baseline we need to break it down to. We are talking about a lot of different steps, and this is very common across a lot of feeding programs. Gover is not doing anything brand new here. Feeding can be broken down into smaller, observable responses. And when we do that, we are much less likely to start with a demand that is way too big for these kids. In ABA, we can task analyze everything from breaking hand washing down to just 47 steps to brushing teeth in less than 104. But too often do we take feeding with as if it's one step, just take the bite, but it's so much more. For a child with food selectivity, take the bite may be the last step in a 25-step chain. Approaching the food, tolerating the smell, touching it, bringing it close to your mouth, opening the mouth, letting it touch your lips, let the tongue touch it, manage the texture, chew it, move it around the mouth, swallow it, and then tolerate whatever sensory experience happens after that. That's a lot of steps, guys. It's not just take a bite. So, baseline helps us understand exactly where they are at. It helps us see what the child can already do. And once we know what they already can do, we can shape from there. And honestly, this is where trauma informed care and good behavior analysis meets. Because trauma informed care is not just being nice, it's not just talking softly or saying, we care about your dignity, while still designing a program that overwhelms the learner. Trauma informed care means we arrange treatment in a way that does not make things worse, that we meet the child where they are and not press them further than they feel comfortable being pressed. And one way we avoid making things worse is by not starting 10 steps ahead of the child, then blaming them for panicking. If a child shows that they can calmly look at food but not touch it yet, that is information. If the child can touch the plate but not the food, that's information. If the child can smell it but not lick it, that's information. And when we treat those responses as information instead of resistance, we start designing better treatment. This is the difference between pressure and shaping. Pressure says, I know where I want you to be, and I'm going to push you there. Shaping says, I know where we're trying to go, but I'm going to start where you are and build from there. That is a very different posture. And for feeding, that difference matters deeply because if we start too high, the child may learn that food is stressful, the table is unsafe, and adults don't listen. But if we start from the learner's actual current repertoire, we can build momentum. We can build trust. We can teach the next steps without turning every meal into a battle. So before we jump into an intervention, we need to know the foods that matter to the families. We need to assess what the learner actually prefers or avoids, and we need to identify the learner's current level of calm, voluntary engagement with those foods. Now that we know the foods and we know the learner's starting point, we need to understand what happens when mealtime behaviors show up. And as always, the starting point for that is to conduct an assessment. In Gover's 2023 paper, the team used an interview informed synthesized contingency analysis, or short IISCA, to better understand the child's mealtime problem behaviors. Now, I'm not going to turn this into a full functional analysis lesson. We already have an episode for that. Please go and listen to it. But the logic behind it is important. The team did not simply see food refusal and say, well, that is escape maintained behavior. Escape may absolutely be part of the picture. If a child cries, pushes the plate away, gags, or leaves the table and the food is removed, then escaping the food may be reinforcing that behavior. But meals usually involve more than one thing changing. When problem behaviors happen, the non preferred food may go away, sure, but a safe food may appear. The child may receive comfort or attention from a caregiver. They may get to leave the table for a little bit, or access to a table or tablet, or simply escape the entire stressful interaction. I know at Thanksgiving, I sure want to escape the table if politics comes up. That's a surely stressful situation, though I'm probably not going to throw my food on the floor. Hmm, Well, depends on what they say. Anyways, let's be honest. This is not parents being bad. If you're a parent, especially a parent to a child on the spectrum, you understand that this is just surviving dinner. When your child is crying, another child needs something, bedtime is approaching, and the meal is completely falling apart, most parents are not standing there thinking, let me isolate the maintaining variable. They're thinking, oh, please, for the love of God, please eat something and please let us all make it through the evening. So, in this assessment form, whether you're using it for meal times or a traditional BIP development, the assessment starts with the people who actually knows the child's meals and the child best. The caregivers describe what usually happens before the behavior, what the child's behavior actually looks like, and what happens afterwards. But the team also goes deeply into what the situation around it looks like. Then the team uses direct assessment to see whether the combined situation actually influences the behavior. In plain language, they were trying to understand what the child was moving away from and what they were moving toward. Maybe the child was not only escaping the bite, maybe they were escaping the food, the pressure, the adult attention surrounding the demand, and the expectations to remain at the table. At the same time, they may have been moving towards safe foods, preferred attentions, toys, comfort, or even a break. That is the synthesized part. Several consequences may work together as one larger package. This is where Dr. Hanley's influence on the model becomes really clear and evident. You can really tell that Dr. Hanley had a play on this paper and that Dr. Gover's been working with him, right? Practical functional assessments has pushed our field to stop pretending that real life behaviors always fit perfectly into one clean category or function. Sometimes the child is not escaping one isolated demand. They are moving out of a whole situation that feels aversive and into a situation that feels much better. And once the team understood the mealtime contingencies that led to the behaviors, they could arrange the treatment environment around it. And this is the part I think every BCBA needs to sit with. Because before we talk about the choice board, shaping, reinforcement, we have to understand the environment where all of that happened. Dr. Gover and colleagues did not just say assent was important. They arranged the room so the child had an actual way to show it. There were three basic spaces in the feeding room: the treatment area, where the food was actually presented and the teaching trials occurred; the reinforcement area was where the child could access the strongest toys, the highest level of attention, and other highly preferred reinforcers after meeting the current criterion, which we'll get to in a little bit. And then there was the hangout area, which contained some pretty good preferred toys and activities, not the highest level preferred activities that the child would earn, but some pretty good stuff in there. And this was not an area that the child earned or worked for. The child could go there at any time. If they approached the treatment table and then decided they were not ready, they could leave and go to the hangout place. If the food was presented and it became too much, they could leave. If they needed a break in the middle of a session, they could go to the hangout space. The analyst did not follow them with the food. The bite did not travel across the room like some tiny broccoli ghost haunting them for the rest of the session. Treatment paused. The child could stay in the hangout area as long as they wanted, and the next trial began only when they voluntarily returned to the treatment table. That is the piece I really want BCBAs to sit with. Assent is not just a feeling, it is not just a vibe, it is not just honoring the no. Assent is built in arrangements into the interventions themselves. We can say that a learner looks happy or appears comfortable, and those observations, they do matter. But if the child has no actual way to pause, to leave, or to say, not right now, then we have not built assent into the procedure. If your boss, if your clinical director or whoever locks the door and says you're not leaving until work is done, that is a hostage situation. And it's the same when we do it to the kiddos. The hangout area gives the child a real pause button. They did not need to gag, scream, hit, throw the food, or completely fall apart before the adult responded. And giving the child the option did not mean treatment disappeared. There were still target foods. There were still clear expectations, shaping criteria, reinforcement, and data. The child was still being taught. The difference was that teaching happened through participation instead of pressure. And leaving the table was also treated as information. If the child left when a certain food was presented, that told the analyst something. If they stayed for touching but left when the expectation moved toward licking, that told us something. Maybe the step was too difficult. Maybe the food was especially aversive today. Maybe the reinforcement is just not strong enough. That is not the child ruining the protocol or escaping. That is the child giving us information, giving us data. And the voluntary return matters just as much as leaving. When a child comes back to the table without being physically guided, repeated prompts, or blocked from doing any other option, they are showing us that they are willing to try again. That tells us something about trust. It tells us whether the table feels safe enough to approach. And as a parent, that makes sense to me. Sometimes our kids need space. They may not regulate in 30 seconds and come right back ready for a beautiful Instagram parent moment. Real life is a lot messier than that. But sometimes space is exactly what makes participation possible. The hangout area was not the end of treatment, it was part of the treatment. It made opting out safe and returning meaningful and absent literally observable throughout the session. And once the child has a real way to opt out and return, then we can talk about what actually happens at the table. And this is where choice boards, shaping, differential reinforcement all come in. And this is where I want to slow down and get really practical because up to this point, we have talked about the caregiver interview, food selection, preference assessments, baseline engagement, functional assessments, and the hangout space. All of that sets us up for the intervention itself. But now we get into the question I know a lot of you guys are asking, what does this actually look like, right? So let's walk through this step by step. So remember, the room has three basic spaces. There was the treatment table, the reinforcement area, and the hangout space. The child is at no point trapped at the treatment table. Once they come over, the analyst or technician presents two choices. The first is which food the child actually wants to work with today. And the second is what do they actually want to do with that food? And this second choice, we need to spend a bit more time on because it's not just the analyst verbally asking, do you want to touch it or eat it? Or like, what do you want to do with it? The researchers used a visual choice board. On that board was cards showing the different ways the child could interact with the food. Depending on where the child was in the sequence, those options could include looking at the food, touching the plate, touching the food, holding it, bringing it towards their nose, smelling it, touching it to their lips, touching it to their tongue, holding it on their tongue, chewing it, spitting it, or even swallowing. The idea here is that the terminal response of eating the food is broken down into smaller observable behaviors, into a task analysis, right? The board then made those behaviors visible to the child. And depending on the child that you're working with, this board could be using photographs, it could use simple pictures, you could AI generate pictures of the food, it could have symbols, it could have written words for the learner. It's going to depend on the child that you're working with. The exact design is less important than the purpose. The learner should be able to see the available options and understand what they are choosing and what they're choosing to do. This cannot be one of those ABA choice boards where we pretend there are six choices, but the only answer the adult will willingly actually accept is eat the bite. That is not choice. That is a demand wearing a costume, right? If touching the food is on the board, the child has to be allowed to choose touching the food. The technician or analyst does not let them select touch and then say, "Great, now let's take a bite." The selected response is the response for the trial that leads to reinforcement. And before the researchers introduced the full shaping contingency, they first used the board during baseline. And I think this part is incredibly important because it helped them avoid guessing where to begin. During the baseline, the child could select any response on the board, and the response produced full reinforcement packages. So if the child chose to just look at the food, full reinforcement. If they chose to touch the plate, guess what? Full reinforcement. If they decided to smell it or lick it, boom, full reinforcement. And if they decided to take a bite and eat it, well, why are they here? But also full reinforcement. The goal is to find out what level of interaction the child selected voluntarily when reinforcement was equal across the options. That gives us a very different kind of baseline. We are not finding out what the child will do after repeated prompting. We are not finding out what they will tolerate when the adult refuses to remove the food. We are finding out where they actually naturally choose to engage with all of the options that are available and being equally reinforced. And this also tells us a lot about the reinforcement and exactly what it will produce. So from there, you select the food items and the levels which the child most regularly engaged with and selected during baseline. So if the child typically just touched the plate with chicken nuggets, then that is the baseline of where you're starting. The science here is not complicated. It's the humility that is the hard part. The hard part is not jumping ahead because we want outcomes faster. We have got to get baseline and then we have to meet the child where they are. Now, beyond the pictures on the choice board, we also need to talk about the color systems used for it. So, based off of the baseline, certain responses to selected foods would result in a full reinforcement package, while other responses would result in a partial reinforcement of the response. And finally, certain responses on that board would result in no positive reinforcement, though they might still get vocal praise for the interaction if there was any at all. This required color coordinating of the board so the child completely understood what their outcome was going to be. And so, as the child progresses and we start to see progress, what is on the board and what is color coded is going to change throughout the intervention. That is the shaping aspect of the entire intervention. And it is key that the child understands what these colors actually mean. If they are able to receptively understand the rules around these colors, then yes, please explain it to the child. Either way, explain it to the child. But if not, work on using these same sort of contingencies in other areas so that the child can start to learn what these color systems mean. And if color systems aren't the right choice, that's okay. If we need to make this board a little bit more complicated for your child that you're working with, that's totally fine. You can make this board into like a giant first then board, right? So this response gets this reinforcement. This response gets this reinforcement. If that's what we need for this child, then please go ahead. Colors work, but don't feel like you have to be restricted in creativity in this board. Do whatever works for the child you're working with, right? So it is important to understand that the child has a choice here. They're not being forced to move up the hierarchy. They could at any time choose a lower response, and some of those responses are going to lead to low to little reinforcement, and some are going to lead to some moderately good stuff, right? They could even just leave the table and go to the hangout area. That is what real free will, free choice making looks like. Positive reinforcement is differentiated, but escape extinction is not used for this intervention. Analyst is shaping the behavior through reinforcement. not by cornering the kid with food until they give in. So let's actually picture what one of these trials might actually look like. So let's say the child's in the reinforcement area playing with the analyst or the technician, and then decides, maybe with a little bit of coaxing, a little bit of reminders of what could happen if they go to the table, they come to the treatment table. Nobody is physically guiding them over, nobody is repeatedly saying, come sit down. They come back on their own. Once they're at the table, the technician gives a quick reminder that they can leave again if they need to. And then they look at the choice board, see what foods are available, and they choose one. Let's say they pick the chicken nugget. Next, they look at the choice board and decide what they want to do with it. Maybe they choose just smell it today. So the technician places one piece of chicken on a plate. The child picks it up, brings it towards their nose, and smells it. And then the trial ends. Based on what the board says, the response earns. At this point, they then get that reinforcement. If smelling currently meets the full reinforcement criterion, the chicken is removed, the child gets the full reinforcement package, and they may head over back to the play with a technician or access another highly preferred item. If smelling is currently in partial reinforcement range, maybe they stay at the table and get just the tablet of reinforcement rather than the tablet, the toys, and maybe an edible reinforcement is all part of the treatment package. And if smelling is below reinforcement criteria, that's fine. We remove the food and we move on to the next trial. And if the child wants to opt out at this point, that's their choice. That is it. There is no lecture. There is no, come on, you can do better than that. There is no holding the chicken close to the child's mouth and saying, since you already smelled it, just take a little lick. The child chose smell. They smelled it. The trial is finished. And that consistency matters because it teaches the learner that the choice board is honest. When the board says smell, smell really means smell. It is not a secret first step in adult trying to make them take a bite. And an important part of the intervention that should be clearly noted is that once the child has completed the interaction with that food, once they have had that trial, the food is removed from the choice for the rest of the session. So the technician or the analyst or whoever's working with them is not presenting the chicken over and over again, hoping that the fifth or sixth trial, the child might finally give in and choose the harder response. The child selects each available food once, and the session ends after all those foods have been used. This helps the session feel less like the child is being drilled on the same difficult foods until the adult gets the response they want. Now, sometimes the child may choose one response and then go further than that. That does happen with this intervention. Let's say the child selects touch on lips. The analyst presents the food, the child touches it onto their lips, and then decides to lick it. This is a very common part of this intervention is that the children will oftentimes go above where they're expected. And of course, they will step back, but it's because they have this freedom of choice. And I think that is one of the most interesting parts of the arrangement. When the pressure is lower and the learner has control, they may sometimes decide to try more than what was required. And we also need to talk about what happens if there's distress. If there is distress during a trial, the analyst or technician are not just sitting there silently and pretending not to notice. They need to respond like a human being. They might say something like, I know this is hard, dude. A huge part of trauma informed care, and I encourage you all to go listen to the episode on trauma informed care, is to recognize the emotions that individuals are displaying and to recognize what individuals are going through. Because when we recognize those emotions, we validate that their feelings are real. We're giving them the language to understand and to label or tact those emotional feelings that they're having for this specific situation, which can honestly lead to better communication down the line and less disruptive or maladaptive behaviors from them because they're able to express it. But you are not reinforcing this behavior, guys. Recognizing a child's emotions, recognizing what they're going through is difficult because it's therapy. It's going to be difficult at times. It's not always easy going, right? But helping them recognize those emotions, helping them see that we're there for them is extremely impactful. And giving them attention during these moments is not reinforcing the behavior. The child is trying to escape eating, right? Unless the contingency is black and white attention, which I guarantee it's not, then you are not reinforcing the behavior. Acknowledging distress does not ruin the contingency. Helping the child not make the intervention less behavior analytic, right? Giving the child a napkin because their face is messy, because they got ooey gooey, I don't know, pudding all over their hands, right? That is us just being human with these kids. You can be warm, you can be responsive, you can be supportive while still implementing differential reinforcement clearly. You do not have to turn into a vending machine holding a data sheet like, whoops, I spit out a cracker when you do this, and I spit out a video when you do this. We can do better than that, right? Good ABA should still feel human. Okay, now that we understand how the trials actually look, let's talk about how criteria changes as the sessions go on because this is where the shaping actually happens. Once the learner is meeting or exceeding the full reinforcement criteria on most trials across 1 to 3 sessions with zero or very low levels of problem behaviors or distress behaviors, criterion should move upwards. In the study itself, the researchers generally looked for performance at or above criterion at about 75% of trials before moving it. And I would not treat that number as some magical rule that must be followed and belongs in every treatment plan. The point is the criterion increased only after the data show the child was consistently successful at the current level. Criterion should be adjusted and adapted to every individual child. Some kids might require a higher average criterion to pass because their rate of holding on to those behaviors needs more reinforcement, needs more intervention. Some individuals need it just one time. We practice it, we move on, we hold it forever. So, individualizing the criterion to the child is very important in this. And honestly, it's important in all interventions, but that's a whole different discussion. And then from there, the visual board that goes along with the feeding program changes. A response that previously produced full reinforcement might now move into a partial category. That next response up would become a new full reinforcement level. The colors on the cards would then adjust accordingly to the new arrangement. That is how expectations gradually move from looking, touching, or smelling toward contact with the mouth to chewing and eventually to swallowing. But the learner still has access to all the choices. If full reinforcement criterion has moved to licking, the child could still select touching. They simply contact the reinforcement associated with touching, which is now at a lower point in the program. That keeps choice honest. The child was not told you may choose any response as long as you choose the one I currently want. And it's also important to note here that if the data shows that everything collapses after we have changed criterion, we need to step back. If criterion has reached swallowing and the child's performance has deteriorated and a gagging begins to occur, we should not just be holding the criterion in place and waiting for him to surrender. We should take a step back and adjust the master criteria because there is clearly something that is not holding steady here. You might also need to break the steps up into smaller portions. If you are moving from touch to straight to smell, that might be too much. It might be touch and hold for 5 seconds. For many kids, they can move from touching and holding and moving to their face, but that is actually a lot for many individuals. I mean, just bringing the item to their face is could be quite overwhelming. So, breaking it further into smaller steps is critical if you notice that deterioration. That is good ABA. The data changed the plan. We did not give in. The data showed we need to take steps back. Sometimes we write treatment plans and then act like changing it means that the plan has failed. But if the child responding to us tells us approximation is too difficult, then we adjust it. That is not failure. That is science, guys. That is changing the experiment until we find the best way to move forward. That's science. That's therapy. That's shaping. That is clinical responsiveness. And what this intervention and the research behind it shows us is that structure and compassion do not have to compete. We can be clear without being coercive. We can keep expectations without ignoring distress. We can work toward consumptions without pretending that consumption is the only behavior worth measuring in feeding. That is the kind of ABA I want to see more of in feeding and honestly just across the board. Careful, structured, responsive teaching where the learner understands the arrangement, has meaningful choices inside it, and can show us when the plan needs to change. That is good ABA. But if the intervention only works with the analyst in a controlled room, that is different. But feeding does not live in a therapy room, feeding lives with families. And that is why the final step of caregiver transfer cannot be treated like the final checks box at the end of the intervention. In the research, the procedures were eventually transferred to the caregivers. The caregivers were coached on how to present the expectations, deliver reinforcement, respond to problem behavior, and how to handle the child leaving and returning to the table. That matters because the analyst is not going to be sitting at the family's dinner table every single night, right? I don't know about you guys, but I want to go home at a reasonable time. I love my clients, don't get me wrong, but I would much prefer to be eating dinner with my kids rather than my clients' families. So the intervention has to work without us present. But caregiver transfer should not mean handing a parent a written protocol and saying, here you go, run this 5 times a week with at least 90% treatment integrity. That is not caregiver training. That is homework. Caregivers need to see the procedure modeled. They need a chance to practice it with support, and they need to have the intervention adjusted based off of their own capabilities. And I talk about this in my parent training episode. So please go and listen to that one where we talk a lot about why it is so important to adjust procedures to their environment. Doing things in the clinic is a wonderful way to set things up for families, but we need to adjust to their environment, to their world, to what they can actually handle doing at home. And we should not be ridiculing our parents or thinking less of them because we have to adjust so much and maybe even, I know, dare say it, take steps back. Uh-oh. But if you have a parent who has, I don't know, 2 or 3 kids, is working, both parents working full time, you cannot expect them to be running this procedure perfectly. So you need to find ways to adjust it in their home environment to make this actually work for them and make it actually fit in. And it is really important that parents understand that leaving the table is part of the arrangement. This is going to be very hard for many parents, but this intervention needs it to be incorporated for that the child to actually feel like they have a choice in this matter. And I understand that this won't be every parent's cup of tea. I get that. But helping them understand that putting more choice into this situation will help them avoid triggering those behaviors that have led to this child having such a restrictive number of foods to be eaten in the first place. Parents are often worried that allowing the child to leave means they're reinforcing avoidance or giving up. So, part of our job is helping them understand what the procedure is actually designed to do. The child is not earning the strongest reinforcement for leaving, but they also do not need to escalate in order to make the food go away. They have a safe, predictable way to pause. Caregivers also need coaching around reinforcement. If a child meets the current criterion, the parent delivers the strongest reinforcement clearly and immediately. If the child engages in a lower level response, the parent follows the reinforcement arrangement for that response without trying to squeeze in one more step out of the child. And that can be hard for a parent because we always want to push a little bit more. I don't know what it is about parent instinct, but we are always trying to push our kids just a tad bit further. Getting them to understand that consistency builds trust is imperative. Okay, and finally, we should help the parents understand how to respond to distress. Parents should not have to become emotionally blank in order to implement the plan correctly. They can acknowledge that something is hard, they can support the child, they can remind them to take a break. The goal is not to ignore the child until they stop having feelings. The goal is to respond calmly without turning the moment into a negotiation battle. And trust me, as a parent, again, this is a hard one to do because this is our child. We feel as the parents, we should be able to get this out of them that if anybody can do it, it should be us. So sometimes we push through those behaviors even when we shouldn't. And when things start to fail, we get emotional and we oftentimes don't respond well. And this is how we end up in this position in the first place. We rapidly go from, please, I'm begging you to do this, please, please, to screaming and crying or offering Disney World if they just take one freaking lick, right? Parents are emotionally invested, and this is not criticism. This is self-reflection. I know this as well working with parents, but more I know this as a parent of two boys on the spectrum. How rapidly our emotions trigger when you are worried about your child eating. It is easy to become desperate, to start negotiating, to start getting oversensitive to these situations. That is why, as the BCBA, it is imperative that you be supportive, not critical. Caregiver transfer is not about turning parents into feeding therapists. It is about giving them practical systems they can understand, use, and adapt without turning food into another source of family stress. Now, today's episode was primarily about Gover's 2023 paper on an assent based method for feeding, but I think it's also important to touch at least a little bit on her 2024 paper, which takes a deeper look at trauma informed commitments with feeding. And honestly, this paper could be an episode on its own, and maybe one day it will be. Unfortunately, I've already stretched this into 2 episodes, so we'll have to loop back around to it one day. But for today, I want to pull out the parts that most directly change how we think about feeding treatment. And what I really want to do is just kind of walk you through what they did because it's drastically different than any feeding program out there, and it's even different than her 2023 paper. In this study, the participant named Skylar, who was an autistic adolescent, played a drastic role in the shaping of the intervention. And so this is a kiddo, really more a little bit older than a kiddo, right? An older kiddo, if you will. They're all kiddos to me. But this was a guy who could really, vocalize his needs, his wants, his emotions, his feelings. So Dr. Gover and her colleagues had him share his input. He helped choose the foods that he was going to work on. He had input in how those foods were going to be prepared. He also helped select the schedule And one thing I think is awesome is that he chose fewer weekly sessions than the researchers had originally planned. And I think that's awesome that the researchers were like, cool, we'll honor that. That is shared governance in actual practice. It is not the clinician saying your opinion matters and then continuing the exact same plan. His input changed the treatment plan itself, and he still made progress, guys. I know, mind blowing. We gave control to the client and they still progressed. What? That's crazy. And one of my favorite parts of the study is that when it got to sweet potatoes and the fact that he needed to consume a full bite, he just didn't want to. Like, he just didn't like sweet potatoes. And the team was like, cool, we don't need to get to that point. Like, we're good. We made progress in other areas. We're going to honor what you've asked for. And I think that is amazing. We should not see that or call that giving up. Adults do not eat every food, right? I've talked about this multiple times in these last two episodes that I cannot stand fruit yogurt with actual little pieces of fruit in it. Don't know why. I don't need to go into feeding therapy for it. I'm living just a fine life, okay? And it's the same for the kiddos that we work with, right? They do not need to master every food group. It is okay for them to have preferences of what they do and don't like. The goal is never to erase preferences. The goal is to increase flexibility, improve nutrition and quality of life, and reduce the distress around food. Sometimes a learner tries a food and decides they still don't like it. That should be allowed, right? And then I think a really important note to end on for this 2024 paper is the social validity part. And I'm so glad the authors included this in their paper. The participant reported that he felt safe and he felt that he was treated well. But he also said that he was not interested in trying new foods in this method again. Sometimes social validity is messy. A learner can say, I felt safe, I felt like I was treated well, and I made progress. And also, I don't want to do it that way again. That is not failure, that is information. It tells us that even a procedure designed around choice and safety may still be difficult. It gives us something to improve rather than something to hide, because it does not make the treatment look perfect, right? And that probably is the biggest takeaway from the 2024 paper. Bites matter, but bites are not enough. We should also care about whether the learner approaches or avoids the sessions, whether the emotional responding increases, whether they choose to participate, whether they leave and return voluntarily, whether the plan works for caregivers, and what the learner says about the experience when they can tell us honestly. It means collecting the data that tells the whole story. So, in closing, the takeaway from Dr. Gover's work is not that every BCBA should copy this protocol and start a feeding program tomorrow. I think the reality is that we still have miles to go with feeding intervention, but that Dr. Gover's work, her research, has brought us to a next step, has opened the door for a whole new wave of interventions that can come afterwards. It clearly and definitively shows that feeding can be done without using escape extinction and while maintaining assent and client dignity. It shows us that we can still see progress even when the child has the ability to opt out. Gover's work shows us that feeding interventions can still be structured, measurable, function-based, and effective while honoring choice, assent, dignity, and trauma-informed care. It's not abandoning ABA. It's just better ABA. All right, guys, that wraps up our two-part series on feeding. If you are listening for CEUs, head over to aba-ceus.com, find this episode, answer the 5 questions, and you will receive your certificate within about 24 to 48 hours. Thanks for spending this hour with me and for the work you're doing for the kids and families we serve. I'm Jay Burton, and as always, thanks for going beyond the data.
Bye. See you next time.